The world was a tempest of white fury, and Abigail collapsed into its heart, a fallen angel in a tattered wedding gown. The weight of her unborn child was an anchor, dragging her down into a grave of snow and ice. He had left her. The words were a brand on her soul. Jedediah, the man who had promised forever, had cast her aside when the mountain pass became impassable, his ambition a sharper blade than the winter wind. "You tricked me," he'd snarled, his eyes burning with disgust at the swell of her belly beneath the lace. "You brought your shame to my name." Then he was gone. 3 days she had wandered, a ghost haunting the blizzard, her only companion the fluttering life within. Now, as her own life faded, a final, ragged apology escaped her lips, a plume of vapor disappearing into the storm. But through the swirling chaos, a figure emerged, a mountain of a man, cloaked in furs, an axe strapped to his back. He knelt, his eyes, dark, steady, ancient as the peaks around them, fixing on hers. Without a word, he wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and lifted her as if she were nothing more than a lost memory. And as consciousness fled, Abigail clung to one thought. He hadn't turned away. Part 1. The shelter of a stranger. Warmth. It was the first sensation to pierce the fog of oblivion, a deep, penetrating warmth that felt like a betrayal to the cold that had claimed her. Abigail's eyes fluttered open to the sight of rough-hewn wooden beams dancing in the flicker of firelight. A stone hearth, large and black, dominated one wall, its flames roaring with a defiant life that mocked the storm raging outside. The scent of cedarwood and something savory, a stew perhaps, filled the air, so alien and yet so profoundly welcome. It brought tears to her eyes. She was lying on a bed of piled furs, softer than any mattress she had ever known. A heavy, patched quilt was tucked tightly around her. She tried to sit up, a groan escaping her lips as every muscle screamed in protest. Her body was a map of pain, a testament to its ordeal. A shadow detached itself from a corner of the room. It was him, the man from the snow. He moved with a preternatural quietness, his large frame gliding across the floorboards without a single creak. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly now. He was immense, broad-shouldered and tall, dressed in layers of buckskin and fur that seemed a part of him, like bark on an ancient tree. His hair was long and dark, streaked with silver at the temples, and his face was a landscape carved by wind and solitude. It was a hard face, all sharp angles and stark lines, but his eyes, they held the deep, unsettling calm of a forest after a storm. He said nothing. He simply moved to the fire, ladled steaming broth from a black iron pot into a tin cup, and brought it to her. His hands, though scarred and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he pressed the cup to her cracked lips. The liquid was salvation. It burned a path down her frozen throat, chasing away the chill from the inside out. Life, hot and insistent, flooded back into her. "Who?" she managed to rasp, her voice a fragile, broken thing. The man merely looked at her, his expression unreadable. He gave no name, no explanation. He took the empty cup, placed a heated stone wrapped in cloth near her frozen feet, and retreated to his chair by the fire, resuming his vigil in silence. Abigail watched him from beneath heavy lids, a strange mix of fear and profound gratitude churning within her. Her husband, Jedediah, had been a man of loud words and grand pronouncements, his voice always filling every space. The preacher in her hometown had lectured with thunderous certainty. But this man was silence personified. His presence was a physical weight in the room, more powerful than any shout. It was a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt watchful, protective. Her hand instinctively went to her belly. A jolt of pure terror shot through her. The baby. It hadn't moved. not for hours, maybe days. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, panicked sound. The man was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room in 2 long, silent strides. He saw the terror in her eyes, the frantic clutch of her hand on her abdomen. He knelt beside the fur bed, his movements swift but deliberate. Hesitantly, as if asking permission, he reached out and placed his large, warm hand over hers, pressing gently against the curve of her belly. Abigail flinched at the contact, the unexpected intimacy of the gesture. She held her breath, her world narrowing to that single point of contact. His hand, her hand, the fragile life beneath. The cabin was utterly still, the only sound the howl of the wind outside and the frantic drumming of her own heart. And then she felt it, a faint flutter, a tiny, defiant kick against his palm, weak but undeniably there. A wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over Abigail. Tears streamed freely down her face, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. The man didn't smile, his face remained a stoic mask, but she saw the slightest easing of the tension in his shoulders. He gave a single, slow nod, as if acknowledging a pact with the universe, then stood and returned to his chair, leaving her with the lingering warmth of his hand. Who was this man? Why had he saved her? A man who lived in such profound isolation surely had his reasons for shunning the world. Yet he had brought the world, or a broken piece of it, into his sanctuary. As the fire crackled and the storm raged on, a strange sense of peace settled over Abigail. She was in the home of a complete stranger, a silent, intimidating giant of a man, yet she felt safer than she had in months. The man who had sworn to protect her had abandoned her to die. The man who owed her nothing had carried her back to life. In the heart of the unforgiving Sierras, in a cabin built of silence and secrets, Abigail closed her eyes, not in surrender to the cold, but in surrender to the warmth. Her last waking thought was not of survival, but of the wild, untamed mystery of the man who sat by the fire, guarding her sleep. Part 2. The Language of Silence. The days that followed bled into one another, marked not by a calendar, but by the rhythm of the cabin. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine, blinding white. But inside, a routine as old as the mountains themselves took hold. The man, she still didn't know his name, would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as falling snow. He would stoke the fire, check his traps, chop wood, and return with game, all without a single spoken word. His name, she learned, was Silas. She had asked one evening, her voice feeling like a trespass in the profound quiet. She had been eating a stew of rabbit and wild herbs, the most nourishing meal of her life. "I'm Abigail," she had offered, her voice small. "I don't even know what to call you." He had stopped stirring the fire, his back to her. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, a voice, deep and rough as granite, rumbled from his chest. "Silas." Just that. One word. It felt like a momentous offering, a secret shared. He asked for nothing in return. Not her story, not her husband's name, not the reason a woman in a wedding dress was freezing to death on his mountain. He simply accepted her presence as he accepted the snow in winter and the thaw in spring, a fact of the season. Abigail began to learn his language, a dialect of gestures and deeds. A piece of dried fruit left by her bedside was his way of asking if she was hungry. A freshly stoked fire when she shivered was his form of comfort. He once returned from the woods and, without ceremony, placed a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the table beside her. Its wings were detailed with such care, its form so lifelike, it was breathtaking. It was a gift for the baby, a promise. This silent communication began to reshape her. With Jedediah, life had been a cacophony of demands, expectations, and pronouncements. His love was conditional, a performance for the town. Silas's care was elemental, unconditional. It wasn't given to be seen. It was given because it was needed. It broke her down and rebuilt her, stripping away the shame and fear Jedediah had layered upon her, leaving something stronger, something truer. One afternoon, she sat by the single window, her belly now a proud, heavy globe, and watched him. He was splitting logs, the axe rising and falling in a powerful, hypnotic rhythm. Steam rose from his broad shoulders in the crisp air. He was a creature of this wilderness, all raw strength and focused purpose. What had happened to him to forge such a man? No one was born this silent. Silence was a fortress built around a wound. A new feeling began to stir in her, something more potent and dangerous than gratitude. It was a deep, aching curiosity that bordered on longing. She wanted to know the stories his scars told. She wanted to understand the storms that raged behind those calm, watchful eyes. That night, a wild, untamed energy pulsed between them. The fire burned low, casting their shadows long and dancing on the walls. He was cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks sharp in the stillness. She was mending a tear in her dress, the only garment she had besides the buckskin tunic he had given her. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the raw, undeniable magnetism of two solitary souls orbiting each other in the vast emptiness. "You built this place yourself?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. A nod. "From the ground up?" Another nod, his focus never leaving the rifle. "Why?" she pressed, unable to stop herself. "Why live out here, so far from everyone?" He stopped his work. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, fraught with the weight of a history he refused to share. He set the rifle down, his jaw tight. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would finally speak, that the dam would break. Instead, he rose, walked to the door, and stared out into the moonlit snow, his back a rigid wall. The rejection was a physical blow. She had overstepped. She had tried to breach the fortress, and he had slammed the gate shut. Humiliation and a sharp, surprising pain lanced through her. But as she watched his powerful silhouette against the night, another emotion surfaced, a fierce, primal desire. She didn't just want to know his past. She wanted to be his future. She wanted to be the one to breach those walls, not with questions, but with a touch. She imagined running her hands over the hard muscles of his back, feeling the life that pulsed beneath his skin, offering a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The thought was so vivid, so powerful, it left her breathless. This was madness. He was a stranger, a silent, possibly dangerous man. But he was also the man who had saved her, who had treated her with more decency than her own husband, whose very presence made her feel a sense of primal safety she had never known. The love she'd felt for Jedediah was a pale, flimsy thing compared to this raw, terrifying, and exhilarating pull she felt toward Silas. It was a love as wild and untamed as the mountains themselves, and it scared her more than the blizzard ever had. Part 3. The Intrusion. The peace was shattered by a sound that did not belong. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a forest creature. It was the jangle of spurs and the coarse laughter of men. Abigail's blood ran cold. She scrambled to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the stark, black trunks of the pines, two figures on horseback were approaching the cabin. Silas was gone. He'd left at dawn, his long rifle slung over his shoulder to check a trapline near the ridge. He'd given her a single, lingering look before he left, a silent promise to return, but he wasn't here now. She was alone, utterly alone with the life inside her. Her mind raced. Bar the door. Hide. But it was too late. They were already in the clearing, their faces ruddy and coarse, their eyes scanning the cabin with a predatory gleam. One of them, a lanky man with a greasy beard, dismounted and swaggered to the door. He didn't bother to knock, simply shoved it open with a grimy hand. "Well, well, what have we here?" he drawled, his eyes crawling over Abigail, taking in her swollen belly and the buckskin tunic that clung to her form. The other man, heavier and breathing hard, remained on his horse. "Thought this place was abandoned, Cole. Looks like we found us a squatter." Abigail stood her ground by the hearth, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She would not show fear. She would not cower. She lifted her chin, meeting the intruder's gaze with a cold fire of her own. "This is a private home," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You are not welcome here." Cole chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. He stepped inside, bringing the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies with him. "Private? Nothing's private up here, sweetheart. Especially not a pretty little thing like you, all alone." He took another step, his eyes lingering on the curve of her belly. "Whose is it? Some trapper who got himself lost in the snow." The insult was a spark to dry tinder. A wild, protective fury surged through Abigail, so potent it eclipsed her fear. This man, this vile creature, dared to stand in the home Silas had built, the sanctuary where he had saved her life, and defile it with his presence. "Get out!" she snarled, her voice low and dangerous. Cole's grin widened. He enjoyed her defiance. He raised a hand as if to touch her face. "Or what? You and the little one gonna fight me?" At that moment, a new quality entered the air. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The firelight seemed to dim. A shadow fell across the doorway, vast and absolute. "She's not alone." The voice was not a voice. It was the sound of rockfall, of an avalanche starting high on a peak. It was Silas. He stood there, framed by the doorway, his rifle held loosely in one hand, not yet raised but ready. He looked like a god of the mountain, an avenging spirit summoned from the snow and stone. His eyes were not calm now. They were chips of obsidian, burning with a cold, lethal light. Cole and his companion froze. The change in atmosphere was palpable. The swagger drained from Cole's face, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a man who has just kicked a hornet's nest and realized it's the size of a bear. "Now, hold on," Cole stammered, raising his hands. "We was just passing through. Didn't know the place was claimed." "It is," Silas said, the two words carrying the weight of a death sentence. He took a single, deliberate step into the cabin. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't need to. His very presence was the threat. The man on the horse, seeing the shift in power, was already turning his mount. "Let's go, Cole. It ain't worth it." Cole backed away slowly, his eyes darting between Silas's face and the rifle. "No trouble here, mister. We're leaving." They scrambled away, their retreat clumsy and panicked, a stark contrast to their arrogant arrival. They spurred their horses and vanished back into the trees, leaving only a foul scent and a lingering tension in the air. Silas didn't watch them go. His gaze was fixed on Abigail. He lowered the rifle and crossed the room to her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw something new in his eyes. It was respect. It was awe. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't pleaded. She had stood like a queen in her castle, ready to defend her own. He reached out, not to her belly, but to her face. His calloused thumb gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated passion that arced between them. The danger had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. He had not just saved her from the storm. He had not just protected her from those men. He was claiming her, and she was claiming him. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Abigail," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive growl. It was the first time he had spoken her name with such intensity. In his mouth, it was not just a name, it was a vow, a brand. It said, "You are mine, this is our home, and I will burn the world to the ground before I let anyone harm you." Part 4. The Thaw. The incident with the intruders changed everything. The unspoken boundary between them had been breached, not by words, but by shared peril. A new, charged intimacy settled into the cabin, as tangible as the scent of pine from the fire. Silas no longer seemed like a mere protector. He was a partner. He would watch her now, his gaze lingering when she moved about the room, a possessive heat in his eyes that made her skin tingle. The silence between them was no longer just comfortable. It was laden with a simmering passion. A simple brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup of broth felt like a caress. The way his eyes followed the curve of her throat when she drank sent shivers down her spine. They were two poles of a magnet, circling closer and closer, the pull growing more irresistible with each passing day. One evening, a blizzard, fiercer than any before, descended upon the mountain. It was a wild, screaming thing, shaking the sturdy cabin to its foundations. The wind howled like a legion of demons, clawing at the shutters. Inside, however, the fire roared, creating a bubble of warmth and light against the fury of the storm. Abigail sat on the hearthrug, her back against the warm stones, stitching a small blanket from scraps of wool. Silas was on his stool nearby, sharpening his hunting knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic shh, a counterpoint to the wind's shriek. The intensity of the storm seemed to mirror the tempest in her own soul. She could bear the silence no longer. She needed to know. "Did you lose someone, Silas?" she asked, her voice soft but clear over the storm's roar. The scraping of stone on steel stopped. His hands went still. For a long, tense moment, he didn't answer. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "Yes." The single word hung in the air, heavy and cold. "Who?" she whispered, her heart aching for him. He set the knife and stone down carefully. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of old, deep-seated pain. "A wife," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "And a daughter." The confession stole the air from Abigail's lungs. A wife, a daughter. The words explained everything. The silence, the isolation, the fortress he had built around his heart. "Oh, Silas," she breathed, a wave of empathy washing over her. "I'm so sorry." He gave a curt, sharp nod, as if that was all the grief he would permit himself. Minutes passed, the only sounds the fire and the wind. Then she felt it. A sharp, powerful kick from the baby, as if it were responding to the story, to the pain in the room. Before thought could intervene, before he could retreat back into his shell of silence, she acted. She reached out, took his large, scarred hand, and pulled it to her belly. His hand was stiff, resistant at first, but she held it firm. "Feel," she whispered. Just then, the baby kicked again, a strong, rolling motion directly against his palm. Silas's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and wonder. His calloused fingers, which could fell a tree or field dress a deer with brutal efficiency, were now trembling slightly against her skin. He looked from her belly to her face, his stoic mask completely shattered. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Not just pain, but a profound, terrified hope. "He's strong," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Or she," Silas whispered back, his voice hoarse, "like her mother." Their eyes locked, And in that moment, the world outside, the storm, the past, it all fell away. There was only the two of them, bathed in the golden light of the fire, connected by the new life that pulsed between them. The air crackled with more than just embers. It was thick with a wild, desperate need. He leaned forward, and she met him halfway. His lips were chapped and firm, tasting of wood smoke and winter. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and longing, of two starving souls finding sustenance. It was rough and hungry, a collision of pain and hope. His arms, powerful as steel bands, wrapped around her, pulling her against his hard chest. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the thick buckskin of his shirt, answering his raw passion with her own. This was not the chaste love of poems and songs. This was something elemental, forged in fire and ice. It was a love that acknowledged scars, that understood loss, and that chose to live anyway. As the wind howled its wild song around the cabin, Silas's hand remained on the life she carried, a silent, sacred vow. They were no longer just two survivors. They were the beginning of a new, wild, and defiant story. Part 5. The Cry of Life. It began without warning. A searing pain, sharp as a shard of ice, ripped through Abigail's side. The wooden spoon she was stirring the stew with clattered to the floor. She cried out, clutching her belly as she doubled over. It was too soon. Weeks too soon. But the baby had its own timetable, one dictated by the wildness of the mountains, not the calendars of men. Silas was at her side in a heartbeat. He had been securing the door against the renewed storm, but he turned, his senses preternaturally attuned to her. One look at her face, pale and beaded with sweat, told him everything. "It's time," she gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He didn't speak. There was no need. The time for silence was over. The time for action was here. With an effortless strength that still stunned her, he swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed of furs. His movements were a blur of efficiency. He stoked the fire until it roared, gathered clean cloths, filled a basin with water, his face set in a mask of intense concentration. He was preparing for a battle, and he would not lose. The world narrowed for Abigail, becoming a vortex of pain and pressure. Each contraction was a wave that threatened to pull her under. The fear was immense, a cold dread that this new life, so fiercely protected, might be extinguished before it had even begun. She was bringing a child into a world that had tried to kill her. But Silas was her anchor. He knelt beside her, his presence a bulwark against the storm inside and out. He held her hand, his grip strong and steady, absorbing her pain into himself. When she screamed, he did not flinch. When she sobbed that she couldn't do it, that she wasn't strong enough, he leaned close, his lips brushing her sweat-dampened temple. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice a low, urgent rumble against her ear. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You survived the blizzard. You faced down armed men. You can do this. We can do this." His words were a lifeline. We. In that single word, he bound their fates together irrevocably. She was not alone. She drew on his strength, on his unwavering belief in her. She pushed through the pain, through the fear, her cries mingling with the howl of the wind. And then, a new sound split the air. Not the shriek of the storm, but a cry. A sharp, furious, beautiful cry of a life taking its first breath. It was a boy. Silas, his hands surprisingly deft, cleaned the child and wrapped him in the softest piece of doeskin. His movements were filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. He placed the tiny, wailing bundle into Abigail's arms. She stared down at the small, wrinkled face, the clenched fists, the mouth opened in a cry of pure, unadulterated life. And her heart, which had been frozen and shattered, cracked wide open, spilling forth not pain or fear, but a love so fierce and overwhelming, it was a physical force. Tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude streamed down her face. She looked up at Silas. His stoic facade was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded emotion. His eyes, those deep pools of ancient sorrow, shimmered in the firelight, reflecting the miracle he held in his gaze. "He's here," she wept. "Silas, he's here." "He is," Silas said, his voice thick and choked with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Abigail took his hand, the one that had held hers through the ordeal, and pressed it to the baby's tiny, heaving chest. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You saved us both." His jaw clenched, a muscle working in his cheek. He looked from the baby to her, his soul bare in his eyes. "You brought life back to this mountain, Abigail," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "You saved me." In that moment, with the storm spending its last fury on the windows and a new life nestled between them, the past was finally laid to rest. They were not defined by what they had lost, but by what they had just found. In the heart of the wild, two broken souls and one new one had become a family, forged not by law or by blood, but by fire, by ice, and by a love that was strong enough to command life from the jaws of death. Part 6. The Ghosts of the Past. Spring came tentatively to the Sierras, a slow, grudging retreat of the snow that revealed patches of damp, dark earth. Life returned with the birdsong and the budding of the trees. Inside the cabin, a new kind of life had already taken root. They named the baby Caleb, a name that meant faithful and devotion. The cabin, once a bastion of silent solitude, was now filled with the gurgles and cries of a baby, and, remarkably, with the low murmur of conversation. The birth had been a crucible, melting away the last of Silas's reserve. He spoke more now, his words still carefully chosen, but no longer rationed like scarce supplies. He would tell her about the habits of the deer, the best places to find wild herbs, the way the wind's direction foretold the weather. But he never spoke of the wife and daughter. Their names, Eliza and Lark, were ghosts that still haunted the edges of their new happiness. Abigail knew that for their family to be whole, those ghosts had to be faced. One evening, as she sat nursing Caleb by the fire, she watched Silas stare out the window, his familiar haunted look returning to his eyes. The setting sun cast long shadows, and one seemed to fall directly from his heart. "You're thinking of them," she said gently. It wasn't a question. He didn't turn. "Every day," he admitted, his voice low. "But more today." This was Lark's birthday. Abigail's heart clenched. She rose slowly, Caleb cradled in her arms, and went to stand beside him. She touched his arm, offering her strength. "Tell me about them, Silas. Don't carry them alone anymore." He finally turned, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it was a physical presence. He looked at Caleb, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path through the weathered lines of his face. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears. She had hair like fire and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. She saw something in me no one else did. She saw a home, not a wanderer. He paused, swallowing hard. "And Lark, our little bird. She was all light and joy. She had my eyes, but her mother's spirit. She wanted to fly." He told her the story then, the words pouring out of him like a river breaking through a dam. He had been a tracker, sometimes for the law, sometimes for himself. He was wrongly accused of being part of a rustling gang by a corrupt marshal. He wasn't home when they came. They didn't come to arrest him. They came for revenge. They burned his cabin to the ground. They said they didn't know they were inside, Silas said, his voice turning to ice. But I found the tracks. They barred the door from the outside. Abigail gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth, her own tears falling for the woman and child she never knew. I hunted them, Silas continued, his eyes becoming the cold, lethal chips of obsidian she had seen when he faced the intruders. All 3 of them. I used the skills they'd paid me for. The last one, I buried him under the first snow of the season. And then, I stopped speaking. Words had brought nothing but lies and death. Silence was my penance, my shield. He looked at her, his gaze raw and vulnerable. I built this place to disappear, to let the man I was die. But then you came, Abigail. You fell out of the sky in a wedding dress, with a fire in your eyes and a life inside you. You wouldn't let me disappear. She stepped closer until her body was pressed against his. She reached up and wiped the tear from his cheek. You built this place from the ashes of your old life, she whispered. But it wasn't a tomb, Silas. It was a cradle, waiting for us. He looked down at Caleb, then back at her, his soul laid bare. I am so afraid, he confessed, the admission costing him everything. Of losing this, of losing you. And I am afraid too, she answered, her voice fierce. But the only thing more terrifying than loss is refusing to live because of it. We survived, Silas, both of us. Their memory doesn't have to be a ghost that haunts you. Let it be a blessing that brought you here, to us. He searched her eyes, finding not pity, but a love as fierce and strong as his own. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss not of wild passion this time, but of profound, healing truth. It was a kiss of acceptance, of shared pasts and a common future. The ghosts didn't vanish, but they were no longer haunting. They were simply part of the story, the tragic prologue to a new chapter. A chapter that began now, with 2 survivors and a child, standing together in a cabin built of silence, and now, finally, filled with love. The seasons turned, and the mountain, once a place of death and survival, became a home. The garden Abigail planted yielded squash and beans, and Caleb grew strong, his laughter echoing in the quiet clearing. Silas, the silent mountain man, was now a father and a husband, his deep voice often rumbling in a soft song for his son. Love, they learned, was not about grand promises, but about the quiet, daily acts of living. It was in the way he carved her a new, more comfortable chair, in the way she saved him the best part of the stew, in the way they stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in hues of gold and rose, their son held securely between them. Their story teaches us that the most profound healing can be found in the quiet spaces, and that family is not something you are born into, but something you build. It is forged in the fires of adversity and sheltered by the strength of a love that chooses to stay. The trail doesn't always lead where you expect, but sometimes it leads you home. We hope you were touched by this story from the untamed heart of the West. If you enjoyed our tale, please like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of survival, courage, and love.